Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Lecture 3 of English 1120, Time and History in Literature. So tonight in Lecture 3, we'll be dealing with Virgil's Aeneid. So I hope everyone had a chance to read the readings for tonight, Book 1 and 2 of the Aeneid, or at least got a healthy start on those. And before we get started on discussing the Aeneid, I wanted to remind everyone, I've mentioned it a couple of weeks, but next Friday, there will be the first assignment, which is a short post I've asked you to put onto the discussion forum. Simply your impressions, your thoughts, no question to be answered or any of that sort on either the Odyssey, the readings that we've done of that, or of the Aeneid, which we're discussing this week and next. Before we proceed to the Aeneid, any questions on the assignment for next week? And again, I'll ask you to raise your hands if you have a comment or question of any time during the class. Raise your hand rather than just unmute yourself. That might save static. So I don't see any hands. I see a hand now. Sarah? So unmute yourself, Sarah.
Sorry. So we just have to write on the discussion forum. It's not like a doc that we have to submit.
That's right. So you can just post on the discussion forum. You don't have to save it as a Word document or anything like that and submit it. Just post on the forum. I'll ask you for, so very good question. So for assignment 3, which is the full research essay, I'll ask you to do, to send it in as a Word or a PDF. So good question, Sarah. Thank you. I'm sure others had that. Any other questions on assignment 1? Okay, so not seeing any hands, I'm going to move on to our discussion of the Aeneid now. So before we get started in terms of going through the discussion, maybe a first take general impressions. Who of those who've had a chance to do some of the reading, maybe show of hands if you want to jump in and give some initial thoughts. Liked it, didn't like it, was interested by this, was not interested by that, what have you. Any takers on first thoughts on the Aeneid? Jen.
I really liked it. It was a little bit difficult to read because there's so much history that kind of unravels throughout the story. But it was nice to I guess it was a lot of Googling words and characters to see who they are and better understand their role in the story. But otherwise, I think it was well written and very detailed work.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen. That's great. So interesting, but with a lot of history and a lot of context. Absolutely agree. I think that's a dynamite comment. So you'll see I've got a PowerPoint presentation that'll guide us through some of the context, and we'll go through that. I've put in a lot more than really we'll have time to go through and is really needed, but it's just in case people do want to dig into that context a bit more. So there's cultural context, so the foundation myths that are being referred to there. There's also a great deal of historical context in terms of Roman history, those types of things. So if people do are interested or that helps flesh that out for them, it's there, but it's not absolutely, it's not mandatory to know all of that. So take it how you can. But all that to say, Jen, point well taken. A lot of context there that may not be immediately apparent to kind of the first reader going in. That really enriches it. Can we discuss, Jen follows up with another question, can we discuss the concept of the muse? Absolutely. So let's do that right now. So the muses are goddesses of in Greek mythology and Roman mythology that, so there's 9 of them, and I won't remember all of their names, but of different arts. So for theater, for tragedy, comedy, for epic, for history, the muse for histories I remember is Clio, these types of things. So these different arts, including dance, would be goddesses that would inspire the artist to perform well in that genre. So Arato is the goddess of love poetry. I believe Calliope is I want to say is the goddess of epic poetry, but I have a poor memory for these things. So the tradition has been to invoke the muse. Again, we talked about this in the Odyssey at the beginning of the epic. There's an invocation of the muse. So the muse, this goddess that inspires the artist, this kind of divine inspiration that guides and gives kind of creative ability to the poet or the dancer or the writer of theater in those other cases. So those invocations happen at the beginning of the epics, but also there happen, you'll see in the Odyssey, the Aeneid, if you were to read it all the way through, it also happens at the beginning of book 7 because there's kind of a new beginning. We'll see it in Paradise Lost as well. They're the muse rather than these, say, pagan deities. For Milton, in a Christian context, takes the Holy Spirit or an aspect of the Christian Trinity to be the muse or the divine that he's asking to inspire him to write that poem. So hopefully, does that help, Jen? Anything more? Anything else to comment on there with respect to the muse?
No, that covers it. Thanks.
Okay, good. We also have a comment from Eric here, just to clarify. So back on the assignment, just to clarify, do we pick one of the readings or are we doing both for assignment 1? So I'll pick one and discuss one or the other. Okay, good question. Any other reactions to the Aeneid? Rachel.
At first, I found it a bit confusing because of the perspective coming from the Romans and how it was kind of contrasting the Greeks, especially in regards to their side of the Trojan War and like the Roman counterparts of the Greek gods and goddesses. But I feel like one of the coolest or the most interesting parts for me was the foreshadowing with the 2 serpents that were killing, I think, or attacking Laocoon. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Laocoon, yeah.
And that was like how the Trojans, they didn't understand the meaning of the horse and they thought that it was dedicated to Minerva, and just a lot of that was really cool.
Yeah, so a couple of good points there that Rachel's raising. So first, we hear a lot of the Trojan War through the context of Homer's epics, obviously, and we hear the Greek perspective, and it dominated their culture, and so their later retellings are about the ingenuity of the Trojan horse, etc. This is obviously a Roman perspective that takes a Trojan perspective in terms of seeing, well, first of all, seeing the writing back the Trojans as their ancestors in a way. And the Greeks were in a way enemies of the Romans. They had to conquer the Greeks in Italy, but also in Greece proper. They had kind of a complex relationship with the Greeks, so they wanted to take a different view of this Greek ingenuity that you see in a Trojan horse narrative. So point well taken there, Rachel, on a different perspective on the Greek myths, but also the story of the Trojan War. And particularly in book 2, probably, right? So for me, book 2 is always a very moving book. The depiction of the fall of Troy, these horrors, these horrific scenes that Aeneas recalls there. Of course, for the Greeks, the conquest of Troy is their greatest triumph. They triumphed against this large Asian power after, impregnable walls. And it's a story in the Odyssey of heroic feats of triumph and joy. So here it's a great despair for Aeneas to recall these horrific sightings. So kind of a reversal, as you said, Rachel. Another comment from Jen here. I also saw a lot of elements similar to biblical narratives. Do you want to expand on that, Jen? I think that's interesting. Maybe give an example.
Yeah, I think the biggest one was like the idea of like the promised land, I guess, and discovering that. So I think, and like the idea of lineage, and the importance of, I guess, fate, or um, coming to like, I guess, like prophecy, fulfilling prophecy, or fulfilling fate, and like the promised land. I saw a lot of like parallels with biblical narratives and like the chosen people in Jerusalem.
Well, that's interesting. It's we don't know whether Virgil knew of Hebrew literature. Definitely before New Testament literature, so before the Christian version of that. Although in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, Virgil, there's some allusion. It seems that because he's writing so close to the time that Christ would have been born, that he's this kind of early witness of kind of Christian revelation without really consciously knowing it. There's some sense of that later Christians want to write him back into the Christian tradition because he's also such a great poet. But no evidence that he knew, for instance, of Hebrew writings, but they have been seen. Parallels have seemed to be there in terms of, as you said, well, this exile, wandering to find this new promised land that was foretold, prophecy as political prophecy that we'll talk about here. In the Odyssey, the prophecy is more about individual fate, which is very Greek. Here, it's about the prophecy of a people, which is, as you rightly said, I think is akin to the role of prophecy in the Hebrew tradition as a call back to repent and to follow the law really of instituted by God. So a lot of these parallels that maybe are without influence either way, but parallel themes. So point well taken. Any other comments? Okay, so I'm going to start then. One comment here from Helen. In ancient writing, is it common for them to write how gods easily manipulate human minds? If so, what are their taking on this happening? So I interpret that to mean what is the meaning of this, or how did people interpret the fact that the gods are manipulating humans? Is that the question, Helen? Yes. How do they feel about? So how did ancient people feel about the fact that the gods? Okay, so here I guess we're talking about the Greeks and the Romans. How did they feel about the fact that the gods are influencing the behavior of humans? So it's a good question, and there's not really an easy answer to that, because it's the extent to which the ancients, for instance, believed in free will, the way we think of free will is kind of debated. It's a nuanced field of scholarship of okay, what does the feeling there described in that work mean, with respect to our notion of feelings? And the person said he was swayed by the gods. Does that mean, is that kind of a poetic trope to talk about the fact that he was overcome with an emotion or something like that we would describe differently, but they're really describing the same basic phenomenological state that in no way denies the fact that the person had agency, that the person was free, for instance, but is a way of stating that they kind of were overcome by passion, let's say, or overcome by anger, or what have you. So Juno, in many ways, is an agent, the goddess Juno, in many ways comes along as this person who, through her own actions or through the Furies or other goddesses that she employs, is one who will, in the Aeneid, seemingly take away the free agency of these human characters. And I guess the question is, Helen's question, if I understand, is how did the ancients understand this? As I said, there's a number of ways of understanding that. There's this sense of these being kind of elemental forces. You could explain it that way. They could be divine forces that we have to placate, so to speak. And if one took a strictly religious view of it, like the Greek Roman religious view of it, that these are divine forces, that it's part of kind of an overriding order of things that we are part of and have to succumb to. It's not up to us to question. And the gods themselves they are not perfect. Okay, so they're going to have their own human-like emotions, and that's a different view of the gods than we often have. Well, when I say we, people will, like, the predominant, let's say, Judeo-Christian view of God as this kind of removed, perfectly good, perfectly omnipotent and omniscient deity is not what the Greeks had. They have a polytheistic system with these gods that are jealous, are susceptible to fits of passion themselves. In fact, Plato used that fact about the gods to call into question the Greek understanding of the gods, and say that I would say the upshot of Plato's questioning about these things was to say that we need to rethink them and take a philosophical approach to what the divine is. And for him, the divine needs to be replaced with kind of rational concepts of the ideas, really. So a follow-up question, I believe, from Helen here. Yes, but in the reading, Varus, I think that's her name, just decided to alter the mind of that Queen Dido. Yeah, Venus. So Venus is one of the attributes of Venus is that she controls love and the passions associated with love, and she has her favorite Aeneas, who is her son, and she alters the mind, so to speak, of Dido in the presentation of it. Yeah, in the presentation of it. So as I said, how do we interpret that is an open question. Is that a way of poetically saying that Dido was overcome with passion? Is that a way of saying, so if you were, let me back up. If you were to interpret the Greeks and the Romans as having basically a materialistic view of the cosmos, I personally would not adhere to that, but some people interpret it this way. They could basically have a modern scientific view of the cosmos. There are really no unexplainable mysterious deities, but we'll use these poetic devices from old in order to kind of in a creative way describe or explain when someone's driven by a passion or something like that, by a force that seems to be outside of them. So that is a goddess overcoming them. Okay, so that's one take. The other take, then, as I said, would be that there's this cosmos, and that the gods are forces within that if you're pious, like Aeneas, you're going to try to make sure you placate them, you show devotion to all of these aspects of the cosmos. There isn't one overarching perfect deity. There's a divine force of love, and I have to respect that. And if I don't, if I'm not pious, then that could come back to burn me, so to speak. Or if I offend the king of all gods, then that's going to get me probably even to more trouble. But overarching even all of that, there is this sense of fate. So the gods themselves cannot overturn fate. They seem to be able to they seem to be able to delay it. Juno seems to delay fate, but she's never going to overturn the fact that Aeneas is going to land in Italy and found a new race there that eventually become the Romans. So Jupiter is very clear about that, and towards the end of the poem, he finally says, "This is enough. You've done all you can. You know that you can't stop fate, so it's time to back off." So he finally steps in and tells her to stop and to let Turnus, her champion, be killed by Aeneas. So all that to say, the gods and goddesses are these cause. If we take this kind of religious view, the Greek Roman religious view, would be these cosmic forces that the pious individual, the devout individual pays heed to, tries to placate, show devotion to through sacrifices, through prayer. And Aeneas is known for his piety. That's his trademark. But even these gods are not the supreme force of the cosmos as such. The unwinding of fate is what determines the courses of our lives. Now, Jupiter seems to be able to at least read and see this fate. So he's the one who utters these fates. And fate in fatum in Latin is just is that which is said. Okay, so that which is decreed. So Zeus's utterances, in a sense, could be seen as fate. So one way of seeing it is Jupiter or Zeus. That Jupiter is the Roman equivalent of the Greek Zeus. So that Jupiter's utterances are fate, or that he's reading what fate, this other entity, that's higher than him, has, let's say, laid out as the courses of our lives. So not an easy answer to that question. I know I can't give you a clear two-line answer to that question. It's heavily debated and heavily questioned by scholars to this day. What the kind of the nature of the relationship of the gods to individuals in terms of our own free will, the relationship of the gods to fate, those types of things. I don't think we'll ever have very clear-cut answers to those. But I hope that suffices for now. Any other comments or questions on that topic, or any other first impressions on the work? Okay, so I'm going to turn then to the presentation that I mentioned. We'll use this to go over, as it stated in this outline, we'll talk a bit about the overview of who's in the AENEAS. And we'll go over this quickly. I won't go through every slide, but as I said, it's there given the depth of the context that could be searched through in the poem. So there's then the next section, we'll talk about Virgil and maybe kind of the moral intention behind the work. Talk a bit about the cultural background, foundation myths, the historical context in terms of the civil wars in Rome and the decline of the Roman Republic. And then we'll talk about the various sections of the work itself. So a reminder of where we are in, we're still in ancient literature, in this ancient literary period here before these more English literary periods. And in terms of what that looks like on a kind of to scale timeline, the events of the Trojan War. So we're still hearkening back to this, right? So we'll still be talking about the Trojan War if it took place around 11 or 1084 BCE, and then a few hundred years later, the Odyssey written by Homer, and then 700-800 years after that, the Aeneid is written in Italy, in Latin by Virgil. again, about the same legendary historical occurrences, but this time as it leads to the founding of, or this supposedly the founding of Rome. A reminder of the themes of the course. So time, kind of our point of departure. Time is a difficult concept to theoretically pin down, but where we're point of departure was to what extent could literature, different forms of literature, reveal ways of experiencing time that maybe theoretical definitions couldn't arrive at. And that kind of led to the conclusion that it's, time's only human time to the extent that it's organized as a narrative. And narrative, as we said, is something that kind of unites time and history. It's tied to time in the sense that it unfolds in time, and narration, as opposed to other visual arts, unfolds in time itself, and it represents temporal experience. It represents an action that takes time. And then history in two senses is important for the course, because we'll look at different historical epochs and how they relate to time, but also history itself as an account of the unfolding of events in time has to have narrative again. So we looked in our first work, we saw some temporal themes there. We saw the question of mortality as a deep temporal theme that throughout all literature, and Odysseus had to confront that question, and he embraced his own mortality. Question of the constancy of Penelope in things that change in a temporal world where there is just change. What are the things that we can hold on to that are constant? What gives us permanence? So are there certain things that we can define ourselves around? Is it what aspects of our identity? What aspects of ourselves, our family, our community give us that persistence, that constancy that endures over time? We had this discussion of the descent in the underworld as a way of becoming directed to the future. So Odysseus becomes directed to the future through his descent to the underworld, and through the prophecy given to him by Tiresias. We also noted that the prophecy there becomes Odysseus's fate only as narrated later on. The prophecy itself had a number of possible paths. And then in the Aeneid, we're going to see prophecy again, and we're going to see this time it's prophecy of Rome's future, but for the reader, for the author, it's really Rome's past. So it's prophecy as historical fate or historical destiny of the people of Rome. So let's look at an overview of some of these questions around the Aeneid. As it's the great national epic of ancient Rome, and one of the most important works in the Western tradition. It's describes the founding of the Roman people, and still has this kind of enduring power to move people today. Oops. Who's Aeneas? So he's we discover Aeneas in the Iliad, which is the first of Homer's epic poems. One of the places we see him in book 20, he's locked in battle with the greatest hero in that book, Achilles, and he's on the verge of losing to Achilles when Poseidon intervenes to save him. So Poseidon says he has to save him. Poseidon is Neptune, so the Roman god Neptune, and we see Neptune in book 1 of the Aeneid, right? So Neptune calms the waves and calms the storm. So Poseidon does so because Aeneas is known for his piety, and he mentions the fact that Aeneas has a destiny to continue the Trojan line and found another city. So Aeneas's piety is really encapsulated in this scene. It's such a memorable scene, and it's been represented in various artworks throughout over the last 2,000 years since this work was written, of him leaving Troy as Troy burns down. So remember in book 2 of the Aeneid, you're asked to read that for today. Aeneas is recalling the fall of Troy to Dido, and well, to Dido and other members of the court that are there. And he describes these scenes of destruction. All is lost. There's no point in fighting. He needs to flee with his family and with some remnants of the Trojans that are left, and take them out of there so that they can found a new home. So he leaves. He's been locked in battle. His hands are bloody. He cannot carry the household gods, these representations of ancestors and deities that are kept in the home. So he cannot touch them. It would be kind of to defile them to do so. So he asks his father to carry those, and he will carry his father on his shoulder, and his son, his young son Ascanius, follows behind, and he holds his son's hand. So literally, he's carrying the burden of the past, his father, on his shoulders. He's carrying that burden on his past and leading the future, his son. So it's emblematic of our theme about kind of a relationship to the dimensions of time and history, but also emblematic of his piety, this devotion to familial duties, devotion to the gods, etc. So here's the excerpt. I won't read it. This is the excerpt from book 2 that describes that. And we see on the right another pictorial representation of that scene. As I said, it's often represented. So it's in terms of its importance for Roman culture, it provided their foundation myth. It linked their foundation to the Greek tradition, and because of because of it served as a foundation myth, and because of the poem's excellent quality, it served as a foundation for Roman education for centuries. In terms of, then it had a lasting impact on the Western tradition. So along with Homer, so probably only Homer and the Bible, kind of those three works, Homer, Virgil, the Bible, probably the most influential works in that tradition. So we see, because of Rome's incalculable influence on later European civilization, and because, as we already said, it was so influential for Rome, because Rome conquered and ended up having such an influence on vast swaths of Europe, it ended up serving as the foundation for a lot of later European civilization and culture as well. Notably, you'll see on the right this depiction of a scene from Dante's Inferno. Notably in Dante's Divine Comedy, for instance, so work written in the 13th century in Italy, in Florence. So this, well, actually, it's by a Florentine Dante who wrote it while in exile from Florence. So Dante is depicting Virgil on the right there in the picture, leading him, so Dante on the left, leading him through his own descent into the underworld, here Christian hell, and Dante has Virgil lead him through that, as well as purgatory. But because Virgil is a pagan author, he can't lead him to his tour of heaven or of Paradiso. He needs to be guided by Beatrice, his beloved, for that. During late antiquity and the Middle Ages, it was our primary source of knowledge of the Trojan War myth, and especially the Trojan horse. I just mentioned, in book 2, recounting the fall of Troy, the Trojan horse as described there. We primarily have that from Virgil. There are other Greek works that described that episode, but probably took a different perspective again, not this Trojan perspective. And those works are lost. We only know them from fragments or from works that talked about those works. So let's talk about Virgil and maybe try to kind of an overview of what his intention might have been trying to tackle this epic. So that's his full, Roman name there, Publius Virgilius Maro. So those are his dates, 70 to 19 BCE. He was an experienced poet, but this is his first epic when he wrote the Aeneid. He had written the eclogues, which are these poems. Eclogues are the bucolic poems, so poems about pastoral poems, shepherds in idyllic settings. So that's a genre. So pastoral poems is a genre, and Virgil's eclogues are probably the most famous of that genre. He wrote Georgics, which are a more rare genre, which is about celebrating agricultural life. So as opposed to the pastoral, shepherds piping songs while laying lazily about a pasture while their sheep are harvesting, this is more idyllic. It's more, let's say, it's almost unreal. The Georgics were hard work on a farm, let's say. So idealizing that, the virtue of disciplined labor, knowing the land, that type of thing. And he celebrates and exalts the old-fashioned values that Augustus, and we'll talk a bit about Augustus later, that Augustus was to come to celebrate when he assumed power in Rome. In both poems, there are little nuggets where he refers to the poet. This poet will soon write a great epic of Rome. Okay. There's a tradition that tells us that he dies in 19 BCE and that he hadn't quite finished the Aeneid. So we think that, well, we know that the structure's there, that it was going to have 12 books and the story's there. It wasn't going to have this other whole thing where, Aeneas goes off to another place and meets someone else and they start a whole other adventure. The structure of the poems there, the 12 books are there. It's going to have that structure. It was going to be some pruning around the edges, pruning and additions. So the tradition tells us that on his deathbed, on a ship on the way back to Italy from a tour, I forget where, he ordered, he knew he was dying, and he ordered that his incomplete work, including the Aeneid, be burned. Augustus said no way, because Augustus had heard bits of it, knew that it was in some ways, or it could at least be interpreted as a celebration of Augustus's reign, and forbade the burning of the manuscript, and thankfully so. So question, what does Virgil want us to take away from this poem? Is it just, let's say, a piece of Augustan propaganda? That's one, let's say, a simple take would be to just say, well, it's just celebrating Augustus, and it's just a piece of Augustan propaganda. He was probably, almost commissioned to write it by agents of Augustus to celebrate the reign of Augustus. There are a lot of parallels to Aeneas and Augustus. So Augustus brought peace to the Roman world after a little over a century of civil wars, and he closed the gates of Janus, signifying peace for the first time in 31 BC, for the first time in centuries. So Augustus, like Aeneas, brings peace after a lengthy civil war. So in some ways, what we see depicted in the later books of the Aeneid that you haven't been asked to read, so books 7 to 12, are the civil war in Italy. So he comes, he lands, and he's fighting Italians. So, and this is a poem written for Italians. So it's got to be grating. It's got to be jarring to see, let's say, our supposed ancestor fighting us, or our ancestors on the other side, so to speak. So there's this civil war, but it has to lead to peace, and a destined peace, so to speak, as presented in the poem. And Augustus liked to present himself as the one who brought that peace after those civil wars. More recently, and when I say recently, the last couple decades, critics have seen a strain within the poem. They've emphasized more so a strain within the poem that criticizes Augustus's rule. Okay, so they see it more, they see elements of it, at least elements, within it that can be seen to criticize the rule of Augustus and, let's say, the cost of Rome. So as I say in the next bullet, there's a burden to Rome, and that's a phrasing that is mentioned a couple times. That is emphasized, the burden of, or the hard labor that it was to found Rome, in terms of both the types of innocent bystanders that are hurt along the way. So Dido, Turnus, others. The fact that Aeneas has to sacrifice so much, etc. So that all can be seen as part of the burden of Rome. So I have a comment here. This might be a stupid question, but what are all these poems based off? Are they historical or just a complete fiction story? So good question. If historical, are there historical mention of these gods he's talking about in previous works, or are they all made up? What percentage of the content are actually historical? Okay, so good question. The gods are mentioned elsewhere, but I guess when you say historical, you mean like they would kind of adhering to a world of empirical facts, so to speak, so that we would understand. So people who write histories today don't talk about gods, right? They talk about, okay, well, the economy was low, so that motivated people over here to revolt against the French regime in 1789. They don't say that, well, the gods did this, and then, okay. So the gods were the historical forces, so to speak, in these histories. So the histories, I remember I said in the first lecture that really the first kind of histories before the scientific histories of Herodotus and Thucydides were Homer's, right? So he was seeing the causes of these things in the gods, okay? So who is Virgil basing this on his discussion on? He's basing it on Homer. This is what I just mentioned, Aeneas comes from the Iliad, and he's saying, okay, well, if Aeneas was saved to found a city, let's assume he found Rome. Okay, that's what the Iliad tells us. Aeneas was saved to found a city. Let's say he found Rome. Okay, so there was a tradition that got built up around that, not just by Virgil, but by other authors between Homer and Virgil. Okay, so Virgil, like Homer, is saying, okay, well, what if the gods can be causes of these things? Herodotus, Thucydides, these other historians that, let's say more scientific historians, tried to find other material causes in addition to the gods, or tried to replace the gods or marginalize the gods. Okay, but in terms of the events that they're talking about, the Trojan War was largely accepted to have happened. Okay, so and the primary of it, well, the stories that they had of it were from Homer. Okay. So in terms of actual what content was actually historical, like our own knowledge of that afterwards is, well, we think there may have been some sort of the site of the supposed site of Troy in Asia Minor, Turkey, the coast of Asia Minor, was found in the late 19th century, and there seems to have been some large battle there and a sacking of that city around 1184 BCE, which fits with the legends. So there might have been something. It might have been some sort of encounter that was actual that led to legendary myths, okay? So this is where myth and legend blur together. So there might have been a historical war there, but was there someone named Achilles who was absolutely immortal other than his heel? Maybe there was a tough person there who got legendary status, those types of things. And maybe later traditions added elements of this and embellished here, okay? So the legend built on history, the history became the legend, so to speak. Now Virgil's building on all of that tradition of legend and history, and adding Roman history to it, and Roman legend, okay? And we'll talk a bit more about that, but very good question about the let's say historical fiction, or legend and fact, and where they come together. I hope that's some answer for you there, Helen. You're asking tough questions here tonight. I don't know, the gods, what's historical about all of this? So I was mentioning that that if we try to think of Virgil's intention here, is it, you know, one strain merely a celebration of Augustus? And I say merely, it's that's not to take away from it. There's certainly, you know, it's a noble effort. It's a noble effort to celebrate peace in the face of the awful nature of that civil war, different varieties of civil war that occurred for about a century. But are there nuances to that? That's the question. And I think, as I said, over the last couple of decades, that they've been highlighted more so than in the past. Before, Virgil had been seen as largely just celebrating the Augustan regime. So I talked about one element of it was seeing the burden of Rome in the say the victims that Aeneas has to leave along the way. There's also this question of Aeneas's treatment of Dido. Is that somehow, you know, in book 4, when we get to that, he seems to abandon Dido, and is that a callous action? And if Aeneas is supposed to be parallel to Augustus, and if his mission is parallel to Augustus, are we supposed to, as readers, completely sympathize with that if we see the cruelty of that effort? Then we have this episode in book 6 that we'll talk about briefly when we get to it, about the gates of ivory, that maybe undercuts a lot of what we see in book 6, because it could point to the fact that we're meant to see it as all a fiction, false dreams. And then there's, at the end of the book ends rather abruptly. So the book ends with the Aeneid, not just book 1. I mean, the entire 12 books end with Aeneas plunging his sword hilt deep into Turnus, this enemy, this Italian enemy. So he conquers, he wins, he defeats the enemy. But there's really no pointing to this future, pointing to that had been prophesied. It ends with this act of violence and potentially lack of compassion, so to speak, with this enemy who has been bested and who is down, let's say kind of dispatched rather coldly. So I would say the moral center, you know, just from my view, for what it's worth, is the piety and the Roman way of life that Augustus is trying to revitalize. And there's questions to it. It's not black and white. You know, the poem shows subtleties to it. It shows that this way of life that Aeneas embodies involves sacrifices, and that it's not purely beneficial, but that this is, in the end, what has to be the path that is seen as the most noble for these Romans, according to Virgil. I think when you read the poem in its entirety, that's what you come away with as what is celebrated in this poem. And it can be seen in that way as a celebration of the rule of Augustus as a way of trying to enforce that way of life in Rome. That way of life is really based on duty to gods, the country, to family, and that Aeneas embodies, and that is put in tension with private, let's say, emotions and experience, right? So Aeneas's own private experience and emotions have to be sometimes put lower on the priority order, so to speak. So this piety, so as a theme, is presented in tension with madness, or furor in Latin, and and it can take a couple of forms in the poem. So there's this madness of love, amor, and we see that especially in book 4 in the form of Dido, and let's say that's a danger, that's a temptation, so to speak, that Aeneas is in danger of succumbing to in book 4, and he has to overcome that. And then there's ira, savage anger or rage, is the main cause of his struggles in the second half, and his it's manifest in the wrath of Turnus, his enemy. So Turnus is this very wrathful individual. But we also need to, if we take that point of departure, we have to remind ourselves that in the end, our last image of that is kind of the wrath of Aeneas in killing Turnus. So it's piety in tension with furor or madness, but it's not, let's say, it's not as though it's this absolutely clean dichotomy where furor or madness can be completely eliminated from the cosmos. It's always going to be there, or from oneself. So I mentioned this burden or hard labor of Rome. So this is book 1, line 33 is where we get this. It has, in addition to celebrating Rome, it highlights the costs to Dido, Amata, which is the Italian queen, Lavinia, which is the Italian princess to whom Aeneas becomes betrothed when he arrives in Italy. The other theme, another theme I want to underscore there, and it's tied to the fact that in being pious to the gods and to his public commitments, Aeneas has to in some ways sacrifice, and this again, the costs, the burden, it's tied to the burden of Rome. But one of the costs is, let's say, the private individual, and the poem really highlights that, the costs of losing the private within this devotion to the public. We see that in the form of kind of isolation. There's quite a few scenes where Aeneas is shown as trying to connect to family members or loved ones and being unable to. So he asks to embrace his mother. Let's turn to those lines, see if we can find those. I'm gonna share the, this is the, you'll notice just while I'm thinking of it, I had two links for the actual text. This is what I'm calling the Fagles, Robert Fagles translation, okay? I find it the better translation. The problem is it doesn't have line numbers on the side, but you have to kind of guess it, figure it out there. So I'm looking for, yeah, and Venus has just appeared to him. This is book 1. And if you're using this Fagles translation, you'll notice I'm at the bottom of page 63 of 478. So since we don't have line numbers, you can go by those page numbers. So she had appeared to him, but in disguise as this Spartan huntress. And as she's leaving, it's only as she's departing that the gods and goddesses often become, let's say, become recognizable to humans. At that, as she turned away, her neck shone with a rosy glow. Her mane of hair gave off an ambrosial fragrance. Her skirt flowed loose, rippling down to her feet, and her stride alone revealed her as a goddess. He knew her at once, his mother, and called after her now as she sped away. Why, you too, cruel as the rest? So often you ridicule your son with your disguises. Why can't we clasp hands, embrace each other, exchange some words, speak out and tell the truth? So he longs for this human contact that he can never have with his mother in that scene that we just read, and we'll see the other ones as well here. Oh, I lost my spot. So there's that scene with with his mother, and book 2. So for those of you who made it that far, towards the end, he's fleeing again. He's fleeing Troy. We talked about that famous image, carrying his father on his shoulder, who's carrying the household gods, leading his son by the hand. And for some inexplicable reason, and scholars have tried to come up with pretty weak excuses of why this would happen, but I think it just serves a narrative purpose. He has his wife follow at a distance behind. Okay, they're leaving this war scene, and so he looks back. They get out of Troy. They're in the countryside just outside of Troy. You know, he's getting his bearings. He's got some comrades there. Oh, wait, where's my wife? Oh, okay, she's gone. So he goes back into the maelstrom to try to find her, is encountered by the ghost of Crusa. She tells him, gives him a hint of his destiny to move on, that he will, through another woman, people have descendants who will become the Roman race. He tries to embrace this ghost 3 times and cannot. These were her parting words, and for all my tears I longed to say so much. Dissolving into empty air, she left me now. 3 times I tried to fling my arms around her neck. 3 times I embraced nothing. Her phantom sifting through my fingers, light as wind, quick as a dream in flight. So that's the end of book 2, and that's from, again, the Fagles translation. He tries to speak to, so that another example, again, of the isolation of Aeneas, of him unable to have complete contact with loved ones for different reasons. His mother, because she's a goddess and only shows up in disguises and deceptions. His wife who he loses, his first wife who he loses. He tries to speak to Dido in the underworld. Okay, so this is book 6. So she, I don't want to ruin it for people who haven't read ahead, but so in book 4, him and Dido. So Dido's the queen of Carthage. They have a love affair. He is reminded that his destiny is Rome, and is reminded by the god Mercury to get moving. So he does, and tells Dido that he has to continue on to his destiny. He can't stay there. She is understandably upset and commits suicide. Later in book 6, in his descent to the underworld, he meets her. So in this scene, which is reminiscent of a scene in book 11 of the Odyssey that we read, does anyone recall? This will be the quiz of the evening. So those of you who read book 11, do you remember a character that Odysseus encounters who is so upset with something that Odysseus had done when he was alive, that this character, he refused to speak to Odysseus? Anyone remember that from book 11 of the Odyssey? Either in the chat, if people want to chat, or raise their hand. Yes. Go ahead. Is that Helen? Hello?
Yes, is that guy he fought with for some arm and then he killed in the duel?
Right. So yeah. So it's Ajax. Yeah. So Jen jumped in. It's Ajax. Yeah. So they had a contest for the armor of Achilles, and then Ajax lost, and Ajax killed himself. And then Odysseus meets Ajax in the underworld. Odysseus apologizes and says, it wasn't worth the armor to have lost you, such a great fighter and such a great hero from our ranks. So, I'm so sorry that happened, So Odysseus was very apologetic, right? And Ajax refuses to even speak to him. So Virgil obviously echoing that scene here, but with so much more, let's say, added emotional tension, because it's these jilted lovers, so to speak. So Dido, so again, Aeneas apologetic. It wasn't my will, I just had to follow the gods. My will was to stay there. Again, remember the private that has to be sacrificed in this public duty. And he's pleading with her in these apologetic terms, and Dido refuses to speak and walks away. Okay, so a haunting scene that's echoed in further literature as well. So he's echoing the Odyssey, Dante echoes this in his Descent into the Underworld. So he, in a similar scene, remember we just saw the lines, I'll go back, the lines we saw, the lines we saw when he tried to embrace Cruz at the end of book 2. 3 times I tried to fling my arms around her neck, and 3 times I embraced nothing, her phantom sifting through my fingers, light as wind, quick as a dream in flight. So let's keep those lines in mind when we look at these lines. Also from book 6, Descent into the Otherworld, he sees the ghost of his father, Anchises. So Aeneas pleaded, his face streaming tears. 3 times he tried to fling his arms around his neck. 3 times he embraced nothing. The phantom sifting through his fingers, light as wind, quick as a dream in flight. So basically a repetition of those lines that we're meant to recall from the end of book 2. So too here, Anchises, his father, he cannot embrace again. So his mother, his first wife, Creusa, who dies, and he cannot embrace her. He can see her, he can be prompted by her. The ghost of his next lover, Dido, refuses to speak to him in the other world. His father speaks to him, but again, he cannot embrace him. And then he has very few moments, maybe 1 or 2 moments where he speaks directly to his son, and the whole thing. A lot is spoken about Ascanius, his son. But in terms of moments of contact, it's very rare. And one of them is here in book 12, maybe one of the only ones where they're about to head off into battle, and he tries to kiss his son, but is separated to do so by his helmet. So kind of just a quick description of him trying to kiss his son through his helmet, and visual image of the helmet, this image or kind of a physical embodiment of the war and the warrior stance that he must take because of the political situation he's in, because of the public duty he has. But it gets in the way physically of his human contact with his son. So the structure of the Aeneid. So the first 6 books of the Aeneid are often referred to as the Odyssean part, and the final 6 as the Iliadic part. So the first half concentrates on his wanderings, and the second half he's in Italy, and it concentrates on a war. For modern readers, most modern readers overwhelmingly prefer the first half, and because of that, I've asked, for that and other reasons, I've asked you to read selections of the first half. Virgil himself and many of the other authors would have had the opposite opinion. He refers to having in the second half this greater theme and higher labor in the second half. The story is now on the home territory for many of Virgil's audience. They would have seen references to local towns. So this would have had a lot more, let's say, local resonance. And it could have been also closer to home in the sense that it was depicting what was for them events, in a way, metaphorically, events that were close to home in the sense of they had just lived through Civil War. So these references to Civil War could have been really hitting them home in terms of emotionally being powerful. So in the Aeneid, we have these kind of initial depiction of wanderings recalled in the past, with love that is depicted as a distraction from virtue and piety. Then we have this true epic of war and martial valor depicted starting in book 7. And then we see what we'll see. I'm just going to point you ahead to Paradise Lost. Keep in mind for that is there will be reversed, right? So we have an initial depiction of war. So we have a recollection given to us by Raphael, the angel Raphael, of the war in heaven in book 6 of Paradise Lost, and then what Milton the narrator refers to as the truly epic depiction of love conquering evil in the story of the fall of Adam and Eve in books 9 to 12. So in the Aeneas, in the Aeneid, we have love in part 1, trumped later by war as the higher theme in the second half. In Paradise Lost, we reverse that. We have kind of wars and all these things laying the groundwork for what is the truly highest epic theme, which is love and humility that is depicted in the last part of the epic. So we'll talk a bit about the cultural background. We'll try to get to the historical background and get to book 1 before we finish tonight. That's the idea. So we need to take into account the historical relationship of Rome to Greece. So the classical world had become largely Greek through the Hellenistic age, thanks to the conquest of vast territories of Asia by Alexander the Great. So when Rome began to take over the Mediterranean, it was taking over Greek culture. It was seeing Greek as the lingua franca, so to speak. It's the language spoken by educated people. It was the culture that dominated the region. So the Roman attitude to the Greeks was ambivalent. There's reverence towards the Greeks and their cultural models, but also viewed with suspicion. They're seen as soft due to their luxury and their wealth. And this ambivalence is built into Virgil's work, I think. The idea that Aeneas founded the Roman race has its origin in that book 20 that I mentioned. And then this around the 5th century BCE, that city was identified as Rome. This is the section from the Iliad that where Poseidon describes, I won't read it, why he saved Aeneas. We talked quickly about the judgment of Paris last week, but again, that's a big part of the background of the Trojan War and sits in the background of this as well. So I'm going to assume, since we talked last week about the background of the Trojan War, that we understand what happened there. So according to these legends, Aeneas manages to escape the sack of Troy, taking his son. He reaches Italy, marries the Italian princess Lavinia, according to these legends, and founds a city called Lavinium. And then his son founds Alba Longa. And then a few generations down, Romulus and his brother Remus are born in the city of Alba Longa, descendants of Aeneas's, and the god Mars. So we have a line coming from Aeneas, whose mother is Venus, okay, goddess of love, and we have a line coming from this other foundation myth of Rome, Romulus and Remus, where the Roman deity that's involved there is Mars, this god of war. Okay, so the Romans see both elements in their stock, and these boys are set adrift by this wicked tyrant, and they were washed ashore, as often happens to these boys in legends that are set adrift on rivers, and they're suckled by a she-wolf. That's more rare. I don't know other instances of that happening. They were then found and adopted by a shepherd, and of course, when they reach adulthood, their lineage is discovered. They they restore their grandfather, get rid of the tyrant, and then go to found their own city. So they restore the rightful ruler of Alba Longa, but then they go to found their own city, which was eventually Rome. And over the quarrel over the naming of the new city, it was eventually named Rome after Romulus, but only because Romulus killed Remus in this battle to name this new city. So this is one of many strange legends and kind of tradition of Rome where there's, you could say, within their own kind of cultural background, there's this notion of violence, civil violence. So it's kind of brother against brother or civil strife within the very roots and foundations of Rome. It seems to be built within the cultural fabric and recognized by the Romans as such. Another great example is this the abduction of the Sabine women. So this new city needed to, so it had some male settlers, but it didn't needed to have some women. So they, at a religious festival, they invite over their neighbors, the Sabines, and at this festival, they abduct all the young unmarried women there. Again, as I said, another very troubling aspect of the Romans' foundation myths. So it's a violation of these women, obviously. It's a violation of a sacred rite, you know, they did it during a religious ceremony. So the historical context, I'm not gonna, I'll concentrate kind of on the fall of the Republic as the context. So there's this period here of monarchy for a few hundred years. And then, you know, with the fall of the Roman kings, this period of what's you just termed the Roman Republic. Of course, Roman republicanism evolved over the centuries, but this period of 509 to 27 BCE, and then this last century of that period, the decline of the Republic leading up to the rule of Augustus, beginning in 27 BCE, and then a line of emperors for the next several hundred years. So Augustus initiates that line, and we'll talk a bit about that context. So we have a question, Helen, was the Roman okay with doing that? Okay, so do you mean the Sabine abduction of the Sabine women? Were the Romans, yes, okay. As I said, I think it's like looking in their legendary past, I think they would have seen it as objectionable, but like a legend, they probably sanitized it, you know, and they saw it as necessary at the time. Would they have said, you know, that they themselves think it's okay to go and abduct unmarried women? No, but it has this kind of distance from them because it's so far removed in the past. Times were rougher then, those types of things. Like we think of legends of, you know, the West, you know, gunslingers in a saloon, you know, that, oh, it's different times. You had to shoot that, you know, I wouldn't, obviously today, I wouldn't go into that saloon and shoot somebody for sitting on my hat or whatever people do in those Western movies. But you know, it was a rougher time. Things were different then. So I think there's some of that, but also, and we get this in the Aeneid, there's this question about at what is the burden? What's the burden of Rome? The Sabine women could be seen as another example of the burden of Rome. So at what cost? At what, we've accomplished so much, but let's not forget the broken souls along the way. Let's not forget the Didos. Let's not forget the Turnises. Let's not forget the Sabine women. Let's not forget Remus. You know what I mean? And what's so powerful about the Aeneid is you can see the beauty of the accomplishment. You can see the beauty of a pious devotion to an ideal of peace and order and trying to see a historical destiny in that. But you can also, at the same time, be conscious of the cost and say, okay, yes, we avoided the chaos of civil war where everyone dies and there's centuries of misery. However, let's not forget that means sacrificing private emotion that we need to keep in mind. That means sacrificing people like the Dido and the Sabine women. So very good question. Yeah. So with that, as I said, we won't even be able to begin to talk about, let's say, Roman history, 1,000 years of history. We won't be able to begin, but just for the purposes of understanding what we're reading about the Aeneid, we'll just talk a little bit about that context of the civil strife leading up to the writing of it. And so the Romans were rightly proud of their republican regime that evolved over time, as I said, and it was seen as this kind of highlight of what in classical political theory is called the mixed regime. So a mixed regime combines the elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy with different elements of the system. So as Polybius, this Roman historian, said, it combined the monarchical or the rule of the one in the consulship, that body, the aristocratic rule, the rule of the few in the Senate, and then the democratic element in represented by this other body called the tribunate. So it evolved over time. There had to be kind of negotiations and a place carved out for the plebeians through this, what's often called the conflict of the orders that took place over a couple of centuries. As I said, it just didn't arrive in 509 BCE. So this kind of balance, what Montesquieu would later refer to as this kind of checks and balances of the Roman system. He has a great book on the greatness of the Roman Republic as well. Evolved over time. One of them was this conflict of the orders that eventually accorded to the plebeians a greater share in decision making. In terms of, so that's part of their domestic politics. What people who don't know much about Roman history often know about Hannibal and the Punic Wars. So Hannibal is famous because of being a famous combatant, famous Carthaginian combatant in the Second Punic War. So Punic, that's the Latin word for Carthage there. So and they had Carthage was the big power on the scene as Rome was rising to power there. That's the importance of, let's say, Aeneas, the important danger of or threat that's being displayed when we see Aeneas tempted to stay in Carthage. When Mercury arrives, he's helping to erect walls, like he's helping to build their city, and he's flirting with maybe staying there. So that's, rather than creating this great Roman Empire that would later defeat Carthage, it would, let's say, enshrine Carthage as this Mediterranean power. So Dido's curse at the end of book 4, she's in despair on learning that Aeneas is leaving. She says that let's see, that the people of Carthage and Rome will be at endless war, and that an avenger still unknown, Hannibal, will torment the Romans. So that you can see the line numbers there, but so Hannibal is that the one that she prophesies or utters as a curse at the end of book 4. So they defeat Carthage finally and ultimately at the end of the Third Punic War. At the same time, they're able to defeat Greece. They defeat Greece also in 146 BCE, meaning that they're basically the sole power in the Mediterranean. They, at the same time, were getting vast sums of wealth from Greece and from the silver mines in Spain. So this had the effect of kind of changing the way of life of the Romans. So this is just a depiction of some of the roots of the famous Second Punic War. Hannibal's so famous because he brought the elephants across the Alps, massacred the Romans in several key battles on their own home soil before they were finally beaten by Scipio Africanus in 202 in the Battle of Zama there. But their success on the world stage can often be seen as what led to the decline of, let's say, the Republican spirit. So it took, let's say, over time, this Republican spirit builds up, this Republican system of government, and but kind of reaches its acme and begins to decline at the same time. They become a world power, but in order to become a world power, they have to enable their generals to go on longer campaigns. So they're fighting farther afield than they were before. Before they were fighting glorified tribal conflicts with people 10 kilometers down the road, 20 kilometers down the road. Now they have armies fighting in Greece or in Northern Africa. So the campaigns are not just for that season. The general is not given authority over that legion just for a season, it's for a number of years. And rather than increasingly with these long commands, and soldiers dependent on the generosity of the general to award them land at the end of their campaigns as some sort of pension, then the soldiers' loyalty becomes to the general rather than to the community. And also they get these increasing amounts of wealth. Okay, so there's all this wealth going into the hands of a few wealthy senators, generals, consuls who are able to manage and exploit the wealth generated from the conquests. So we have kind of the type of wealth inequality that you only see in the United States right now. So this is, and I say only half jokingly, this parallel between the decline of the Roman Republic and what we see in the U.S., but also a lot of Western democracies in terms of incredible amounts of wealth inequality, and how that can lead to, well, let's say, the political disenfranchisement of the many, but also their susceptibility of them to fall for demagogues who are willing to give them bread and circuses, so to speak. So that's been written, but there's a footnote at the bottom there. A good book on that is by this guy, Mike Duncan. And if you don't want to read the whole book, there's an interview there with him on the Smithsonian magazine where he breaks down the point that he's trying to make in that book about the parallels between US decline, let us say, and the decline you see in Rome, just for your interest. So all that decline, so world power, long campaigns, meaning that soldiers are attached to generals as opposed to the community, huge wealth inequalities, leads to, among other things, basically a century of civil war, social war between Rome and its Italian allies, civil wars between Sulla and Marius, the Catiline conspiracy, so made famous in the orations of Cicero against Catiline, where Catiline is one of these figures, a wealthy individual, but pandering to the many because he had tried to buy his way to a consulship and had incurred debts because he had tried to buy his way there, and as a result was trying to rouse up others to overturn the existing system. Then Caesar's civil war, so Caesar versus Pompey the Great. Caesar, of course, eventually won, becoming this kind of the first real dictator, emperor. And the liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, try to end this rule of one by leading an assassination of Caesar at the height of his power there, 44 BCE. And then we have the Liberators' Civil War, which is called it's the second triumvirate against those assassins, so Brutus and Cassius. So the second triumvirate is Octavius, who would become Augustus, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Okay, so that triumvirate says, okay, Brutus, Cassius, you can't just go around killing emperors. We have to stop you. Of course, they had their own ulterior motives. They wanted the power themselves. We have the Parisine War, which is kind of just a little blip on the series there. And then full-fledged war after that second triumvirate had defeated Cassius and Brutus. Again, those events are summarized. A lot of these events are summarized in Shakespearean plays. So in Julius Caesar, that play. Then we have full-fledged war between the two key leaders within that second triumvirate. So Mark Antony and Octavius, who would later become Augustus. Okay, and that's, or at least a key aspect of that is portrayed in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. So, Mark Antony is allied, in love with a queen of Egypt, an African queen. So think Dido here, Cleopatra. He is totally devoted to her, at least according to Plutarch and to our, especially in our Shakespearean rendering of it. but also we see that also in the Aeneid. And he loses at the Battle of Actium, and that means effectively that Augustus is the sole ruler of Rome. So I want you to think about the parallels between Dido and Cleopatra. So there's the danger of Aeneas, like a Mark Antony, becoming enamored of an African queen, staying in Egypt. So Mark Antony there was a will read by Augustus where Mark Antony had given all these Roman possessions to children that he's having with Cleopatra, that he was going to live in Egypt. Think of Aeneas in Carthage instead of making his way home. All of these, let's say, giving into private passions, giving into passions of love, etc., as opposed to public duty. These are some of the things that the Aeneid is playing on. These are some of the things that Augustus played on. And then, as I said, with Octavian, we have the beginning of the empire proper, when he has himself awarded the title Augustus, or the revered one. He avoids terms of kingship because deep in their fiber, there's an aversion to, within their Republican past, an aversion to terms of kingship, but he used other words such as first citizen, which princeps, which comes for us later on prince, etc., and imperator, or commander, or person who holds the imperium, which is the control and power. He also tries to restore morals, the Republican forms. So in addition to Republican forms of government, he's also trying to reestablish their ways and customs of the ancestors. So he's trying to reestablish piety and religious cults, etc. So there's this element of Augustus that's also celebrated in the Aeneid. Okay. We'll look at this in the first, from early in book one, which I think gets at something of this, the tone that you see in book one of the Aeneid already, that's referring to this. So the context of this is Neptune discovers that Juno has stirred up the winds, Aeolus, and Aeolus is supposed to have the domain of the winds just on the rocky shore, but he's stirred them up on the sea because Juno has bribed him. And Neptune quite sternly rebukes him and calms the wind on the waters because that's his domain and it's not proper. And this action is compared to an unruly mob being calmed by an orator with the gravitas and piety. Okay. So just as all too often some huge crowd is seized by a vast uprising, the rabble runs amok, all slaves to passion. Remember, passion, madness of passion that needs to be held in reserve by piety, good judgment, gravitas. Rocks, firebrands flying, rage finds them arms. But then, if they chance to see a man among them, one whose devotion and public service lend him weight, they stand there, stock still with their ears alert as he rules their furor with his words and calms their passion. So Neptune was able to calm these winds just as in these moments when there's a rabble that's rioting. So we have a riot, I wonder if anyone could have come down, the Capitol Hill insurrection there, or riot, whatever it was. Could anyone have calmed down with calm, grave words and calm them? This is what's questionable about this scene, is whether piety and reserved reason can overrule the passions in the heat of the moment. So if we think quite seriously about these moments, let's say again the parallel with the United States, where passion, where everyone is slave to passions of rage at the fact that in their eyes injustice has been done to them. So rocks, firebrands flying. The mob is in an uncontrollable rage. Will they stop and listen, stand there stock still with their ears alert as a grave speaker rules their furor with his words and calms their passion. Okay, how realistic? It's a question. It's a genuine question. So we have this as one of the things that Augustus is trying to bring back as part of his new rule, the way of the ancestors. And the way of the ancestors is in tension with, again, with the Greeks representing philosophic questioning of ancestral tradition. So, and this ambiguity of the relationship with the Greeks is also echoed in Virgil. So I'm gonna stop there today. We've done a good part of the context. In doing the context, we've managed to dabble here and there in book 1 and 2 in terms of excerpts. And next week, we'll go through and tackle both 1 and 2 and try to take books 1 and 2, but also take a good crack at book 4 and 6. So I have a question about where the class recordings are posted. So there's links to them on the website. So where you go to the website where you get the actual outlines, the PDFs of the PowerPoints, as they come up next to them, there are links to the recordings, and they're on YouTube. Okay. So thanks everyone, and have a great week.